What is the secret of the Mimic? Well, I think I know what it's going to end up being, and the implications are going to be absolutely massive for the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, from FNAF 1 all the way up to modern day. Hey everyone, I had to butt in here to say that this video has been done for a while sitting in my drafts, but because I've been trying to deal with a Patreon thing, it has been postponed by way more than I wanted it to be. So I think I'll just come clean and explain what's going on with Patreon. I have not been able to access my original Patreon page for a while because with the recent changing of devices, I wasn't able to get into my original business email, which is the one I have the Patreon link to. So I ended up making a whole other business email that is visible on my page. And I'm currently trying to talk to Patreon about getting the original page switched over to my new account. But in the meantime, there will not be any patrons on screen for as long as this is going on. So I would recommend, if you're still donating to the original Patreon, that you stop, because I'm not going to be able to see the money and I'm not going to be able to see who's donating. So at the moment, until the Patreon issue is resolved, I'm going to start leaving it out of my video descriptions. Thank you for those of you who have donated in the past. This is kind of just a really embarrassing problem to come across, but I hope that in the future it will be resolved. And also, I'm going to be releasing new merch soon, which will be overall, I think, a better way to support me, because I love making stuff for fans that aren't just videos. So definitely check that out when you get the chance. Alright, on with the video. I'm saying take the FNAF story as you know it and throw it away, because if I'm right, we've been looking at one specific character in an entirely wrong light, and it's a really important character. So a while back now, I was working with Rytoast on a collab video which you can watch on the channel right now. That video is still pretty up to date, and this theory I'm crafting now is an evolution of what I believed in that one. So let's get started. If somehow this is the first FNAF video you've seen in some time, allow me to explain what I'm going to be talking about so this isn't completely alien to you. In the newest set of FNAF games created by Steelwool Studios, there's been an overarching threat that the community had taken to calling Glitch Trap. First appearing in Help Wanted, this was essentially a digital consciousness that wanted to use the same VR tech we were playing the game with to try and hijack a human body. And if you know anything FNAF, this character should remind you of someone else, because Glitch Trap and Springtrap share a few significant similarities. For a while, it was believed that Glitch Trap was actually the spirit originating from Springtrap, William Afton. However, this isn't the prominent belief anymore. Glitch Trap would have minor roles going forward, but still exists as the sort of starting point for everything in the modern FNAF series. Then we saw a new book series emerge, Five Nights at Freddy's Tales from the Pizzaplex. These books seem to corroborate a lot of events seen in the games, but with small, significant differences. In many ways, it seemed like these short stories were explaining the unexplained. For instance, the daycare attendant. Sun and Moon comes off as strange in Security Breach because despite their significance and representation within the Pizzaplex, they are totally unfit to be in charge of the daycare. When the lights go out, the ultra-hostile and villainous Moon side emerges from Sun, which is a terrible thing to happen in a daycare where kids are meant to go to sleep. These books then tell us that Sun and Moon were not meant to be the daycare attendant, but were reprogrammed to be there to replace whatever the last attendant was. The idea then was to hook up generators within the play structures to keep the lights on at all times, explaining basically everything within that section of Security Breach. These books helped us solve one mystery. Could they help us solve more? Well, the epilogues of each book were telling another story, a longer one. They told us about a group of teens breaking into the Pizzaplex's basement, only to be picked off one by a robot named the Mimic. And here I go having to explain what the Mimic is. Again, rather than delve into the full backstory at this time, I'll just give the rundown. The Mimic is a very old endoskeleton that was created with the express purpose to imitate what it sees. This is because of a special program called Mimic 1. The Mimic from these epilogues had been reprogrammed to dismember and pile up other old robots. And when it ran out, it started doing the same to any humans it came across. And we'll touch on what happened with this friendly guy later when we get to that point. The question many of us now have is this: how far back does the Mimic go? And what's the deal with Glitch Trap? Is Afton back? Or isn't he? To answer at least one of those questions, the modern consensus is that Glitch Trap is most likely some iteration of Mimic 1. We're told in Help Wanted he had been scanned in from old circuit boards that were taken by Fazbear Entertainment. So it's likely that these circuit boards come from the Mimic, and Glitch Trap manifested as an imitation of what it saw in Help Wanted. Help Wanted was an in-universe sort of virtual museum of everything evil William Afton had ever done, so it makes sense that the program would then try to recreate him. So is Afton back? He might as well be because Glitchtrap is recreating him down to his iconic catchphrase. But I think it goes beyond that. You guys are not ready for what I'm about to say, I'll say that. I think the Mimic has not just been around, but they are a legacy FNAF character. Let's take it back. Our first hint about what the Mimic could really be stems from the first teaser we got for Secret of the Mimic, and at the time of writing this, the only teaser. In this teaser, the Mimic, or Jackie, emerges from a Jack-in-the-Box playing a very familiar theme. This is My Grandfather Clock, and it's a classical tune that you'll recognize from FNAF 2 as the song that plays when you wind the puppet's box.
Hello? Hello and welcome to your new summer job.
This immediately set the theorist world on fire, or so you would think. In reality, it doesn't seem like anyone knew what to think of this, but I had to draw connections. Surely there's something we've seen before that would connect the Mimic to the puppet. Something, somewhere, had to give us more context, and I think I found it. But I also seem to have put my own foot in my mouth, because our clue here is one that I knowingly and intentionally brushed away in a video I made a while back. These are the Nightmare plushies. They are odd, Nightmarian-inspired plush toys that you can find all over the Pizzaplex, even in Ruin. But whereas other plushies are thrown about loosely or stacked on shelves, these ones always appeared in the background, like the G-Man from Half-Life 2, just barely out of view, as if they were watching. And I thought at the time that these Nightmarian plushies didn't mean anything. Steelwool seems to just like some FNAF characters more than others, and they put Easter eggs relating to specific characters in their games all the time, such as Mr. Hippo. But I think I was wrong. Now, the Nightmarian is not the puppet per se, but that's only in the sense that Nightmare Freddy is not Freddy, or Toy Freddy is not Freddy. No, it's clearly meant to be the same character, just a different iteration. But I think the fact that it's Nightmarian specifically is super important, and I'll explain why later. For now, we have our puppet connection. So am I saying that the Mimic is somehow the puppet? No. For the record, I do not believe that the Mimic in the epilogues or the Mimic in Ruin is the puppet, for various reasons. But I do think we're on the right track. There's a piece of the Mimic epilogue stories that has always stuck out but never been elaborated on. That being a passage wherein one character discovers that this Mimic was not the only one made. Once the Fazbear Company had acquired the code from the original Mimic, they attempted to create their own Mimics. However, this line was retired because they acted human in ways that were expected or intended. That's basically all the info we get regarding this line. We don't know when it was made, how many there were, or where the retired Mimics went. The leading theory is that these retired Mimics are the Glamrock endoskeletons, since they seem to learn and replicate in a way similar to the Mimic. But it's hard to say if that's the case, because there's never a direct connection between these endos and the Mimic. In fact, the fact that they need to be corrupted by Glitchtrap at all to me implies they might not be Mimics at all. So maybe they aren't. But what if there's a line of animatronics we now know of that has been growing steadily over time that could feasibly be our Mimic 1? Jackie, the Marionette, the Nightmarian, and the security puppet. The puppet line. I hesitate to even call this a line considering how singular and unique the puppet itself is, but what if that's the point? Let's listen back to what the phone guy, Ralph, has to say about the puppet.
I'll be honest, I never liked that puppet thing. It's always thinking, and it can go anywhere. I don't think the Freddy mask will fool it, so just don't forget the music box.
He describes it as always thinking, and how he doesn't like it. But I think it's important that he says he never liked it, because to me that could imply that he's seen the puppet somewhere before, like a different Freddy's. And if that's the case, then he's probably seen it act the same way there as well. What's important about this is the timeline of events, because if we are to presume that the first Freddy's, which is likely where the puppet originates from, shuts down after the missing children incident, how would the puppet have been behaving when Ralph was working there? This might be a stretch, but let me explain. The puppet is haunted by the spirit of Henry's daughter Charlotte, sometimes called Charlie. In the Silver Eyes, we actually see an alternate version of Charlie that's actually a robot, and that's a whole mess. But in the game's continuity, William Afton killed her as a little girl, and her ghost is the one that inhabits the puppet. The puppet then helps the missing children incident victims find their place within their animatronic bodies, giving us the Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy group we all know. But it's been believed in the past that Charlotte's death, along with the MCI, were the reason that the first Freddy's was shut down. Which begs the question, what would the puppet have been like? Totally and completely normal. It was not yet possessed by Charlotte for the majority of the time Freddy's was open, at least presumably. We can play pretend if we want. All of this to say that the thing that could have been making Ralph uncomfortable was that it acted more human and thought, because that's what it was doing thanks to its Mimic 1 program. But I'm not going to die on the hill that Ralph is extremely specific with his verbiage. No, let's instead talk about what the security puppet actually does. This one doesn't seem to be the same as the original puppet, but based on the attached minigame, they had the same function. Identify the child with the green wristband and stop them from leaving. This green wristband kid, by the way, ends up being Charlie, who was killed by Afton outside of the restaurant. And these animatronics being security guards is absolutely massive, because that's literally the only other job we'd seen before in the series up to that point that a human being is meant to do. And given how the Glamrock Endos, when infected with Mimic 1, learned basic shapes and colors like actual children, or a security puppet, this is just adding up to Mimic behavior to me. But I'm not done. The puppet has always been one of the oddest characters in terms of behavior. UCN makes it clear that they are operating at a different level of intelligence compared to the other animatronics.
The others are like animals, but I am very aware.
And yet they still want to kill Jeremy when they're cranky. Now, I don't want to imply that this is an example of mimic behavior because that's kind of a stretch, but I just wanted to say that the puppet definitely acts really weird. And we're never given a reason for this outside of Henry just saying his daughter was really cool. However, if the puppet is part of the original line of mimics, it suddenly makes a lot more sense why they're the weird one out. Why Charlie is considered so unique. But then we come to Nightmarion. What's this guy's deal? First off, I want to emphasize that these two are not the same person. Same root character, but totally different personalities. The Nightmarion is much more clearly evil and takes pride in the pain it inflicts on the player character.
Let's taste death again and again and again.
Whereas the puppet really just wants us to get out of their way. So what's the connection here? Well, first thing I want to talk about with this guy is that it seems like Scott Cawthon and Steel Wool have been trying their best to recanonize the Nightmarion. Originally, Cawthon did not consider the Halloween DLC of FNAF 4 to be canon, and that included the Nightmarion. In hindsight, this also makes a lot of sense because the crying child of FNAF 4 likely wouldn't have a connection to the puppet since they may not have even existed yet as a character. But what if they did? After all, if we consider Jackie to be part of the puppet line, it would have gone back as far as the 70s. Anyway, since Help Wanted, Security Breach, Ruin, and all of that has come out, they've been back in some force, in an arguably larger role than they had in FNAF 4. But if the Nightmarion presumably never actually existed, why are they quote-unquote back? Well, I think I have an answer to that, but you'll have to bear with me. I believe that the Nightmarion is not a physical entity and never was. However, the idea it represents is very important to the Mimic. We've established by now that I believe the puppet line was made using Mimic 1, and they were retired with the sole exception of Charlie's puppet. So I believe that the Nightmarion symbolizes the Mimic as a representation of the bad side of its past. The quote-unquote secret of the Mimic is more the secret of the puppet. But I wouldn't be fully satisfied with this answer if there wasn't more tying the Mimic to Nightmarion and to Charlie specifically. You might remember this room from Security Breach. For a while, this was the linchpin piece of evidence to show that somehow, someway Palpatine, the crying child, returned. But since we don't really have much aside from this display to work with, I'm willing to write that one out for now in favor of something I find more compelling. Something you may not know about this room is that it is actually very specifically tied to one character. One who you would never find by simply observing it in-game, but instead by observing it in the game files. The door by connecting this room to the previous trash sequence with Glamrock Chica is labeled in the files as, wait for it, Charlie door. Although there are other doors in Security Breach like this one is specifically labeled under this name, meaning, at least to me, that this room is actually connected to the puppet. With that in mind, what do I think this room is? Well, throughout the Mimic short story and the Storyteller short story, we're told that the Mimic enjoys drawing on colored paper as it observed David do. This sort of imitated behavior then follows into the Storyteller, where Edwin Murray does the same thing seemingly when he's trapped inside the supercomputer housing Mimic 1. In my opinion, this underground silo that we haven't had an explanation for could be two things. One, this is the aforementioned Storyteller room, which was taken down by the time of Security Breach and could have potentially been moved here. That seems unlikely though, which leads me to option 2. This is a storage room of sorts. With all the Nightmarion parts as well as the Afton family display, it leads me to believe that Vanny has been here, especially since you can, at times, encounter her in this portion of the game. And while it's not Vanny's lair, which resides in Fazerblast, it is still a storage area of sorts, where the Mimic's various drawings and messages are scribbled and tucked away. The reason that clearly Afton family is tucked away here, I believe, is because that's Vanny's contribution to the evidence room, having been heavily influenced by the Mimic's Afton persona. But one thing that bothered me about these connections is how they were laid out. Mimic is connected to the Nightmarian bots and the plushies, which then connect back to Charlie, but the only direct connection to Charlie is through the aforementioned door name. And is this really the linchpin I'm going to base my theory on? Well, given the circumstances, I think this is still our #1 best bet, and I'll explain why. A while ago now, during the 10th anniversary, we saw the second ever interview with Scott Cawthon from Daco. When it came to talking about Security Breach's story, Scott had this to say.
I had a very specific story in mind, and it is very different than the one that got in the game, because what I was trying to do was I was trying to tell Steel Wool to do specific things throughout the game, put specific items in specific places, have specific characters do certain things, meanwhile not telling them what the story plot was. That didn't work out very well because they got all of these pieces and they thought it was their job to connect them in a way that made sense. And so really what you ended up having were the same pieces but telling completely different stories. And since I was trying to kind of tell a specific story with mine that went a certain direction, they were taking pieces I didn't fully understand and trying to craft a story out of them.
Essentially, Scott's style of managing Security Breach's story was very hands-off, so Steel Wool would try to compensate and connect bits and pieces that were never meant to be. One of the biggest changes Steel Wool made to Scott's original ideas was Burn Trap.
When it comes to Burn Trap, originally Burn Trap was never supposed to move, almost like a some kind of decaying movie prop, and you never fully understood what his purpose was. And he had a very specific purpose.
At first, Burn Trap was meant to be a stationary object, described as like a movie prop you saw out of the corner of your eye. Was he there? Was he not? Who knows? But by the time Security Breach came out, he was upgraded from Half-Life G-Man that I've already referenced to full-on final boss, which also leads me to believe that the Charlie door is a piece of this puzzle. You see, I believe the Charlie door is one of these details Scott planted there without telling Steel Wool why. I believe this because we have another very similar piece of evidence for a theory that was actually removed, likely because it wasn't what Scott wanted. Originally, the sprite for the princess from Princess Quest had a name in the game files labeled Cassidy. For many, this was confirmation of Golden Freddy's involvement in Security Breach's story, since their name is Cassidy. But this file name was later changed in an update, likely putting that theory to bed. But Charlie door never changed, which leads me to believe Scott meant for it to be there. He meant for us to draw a connection between the puppet and the mimic, and to do it through the sticky note room. But I have one last piece to add on to this theory that I think could be on the more controversial side. One thing we know about the mimic is that at some point they were involved in a fire, but it's never been clear when and where. It could be the Fall Fest fire alluded to in Help Wanted 2, or the Fazbear Frights fire seen at the end of FNAF 3. But the big fire most seem to attribute the mimic to is the FNAF 6 fire. But we don't ever see the mimic in FNAF 6. Or do we? The security puppet. If I'm right, and the mimic is in fact considered part of the puppet line, it's possible that part of Henry's plan to bring everything together and burn it down did include the mimic, which had become the security puppet and was retired. Looking at the security puppet further only convinced me. We have that Jackie or Funtime-like face split, and the glowing yellow eyes similar to the mimic's. In comparing the Nightmarian to the puppet, they don't actually look all that similar. But comparing the Nightmarian to the security puppet, I think they look a lot more similar. Even still, this puppet wears a funny jester hat, which might mean that this is the jester costume described over and over in the stories the mimic appears in. There's also the fact that in order to play a minigame where you see a different puppet's past, you have to use this one, as if it saw it and is mimicking it. I just think a lot of this is adding up to the security puppet being the mimic and we didn't realize. So let's pull all of this together into one short TLDR. Edwin Murray creates the mimic in 1979 only to abandon it in the same factory it was made in. Fazbear Entertainment then arrives to upgrade the mimic and takes the Mimic 1 code for themselves. They notice that the mimic had been designed to fit inside of a shell named Jackie, which they use as the basis for their own new line of mimics, the puppets. These consist of the Charlie puppet, Jackie, technically speaking, and the original mimic, which had been revitalized as the security puppet. During their debut at Freddy's, however, the puppet failed. Charlie was killed and the project was scrapped. The security puppet would be tucked away, with William Afton taking inspiration from the line to build his new animatronics, the Fun Times, which not only included the split face design, but also had vocal mimicry. Meanwhile, Henry and the shareholders held on to the original puppet, bringing it to the FNAF 2 location before tucking that away as well, or maybe even losing it. By the time of FNAF 6, Henry reacquires the security puppet and traps the Charlie puppet in Lefty, making sure both of them are present for the fire. While Charlie burns away, the security puppet somehow manages to survive, where it's then recovered by Fazbear Entertainment shareholders. They give it circuit boards to help one its developers only for the new program to reflect William Afton, while the robot is sent to the newly constructed Pizzaplex to be returned to the pizza place it was pulled from. But when it arrives here, it creates a death trap for anyone who finds themselves inside, and Glitchtrap makes its way into the Pizzaplex. That's the total summation anyway. Am I wrong? Maybe, probably, but I think there's enough here that I think is pointing in this direction. In any case, I think it only proves that there's more to the Mimic story that we've yet to see play out. And if I'm right, a huge side to the puppets that we haven't seen at all. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.